Welcome to the second seminar for the Friday term. My name is Miguel Figliozzi in the Civil Engineering Department, and together with Liming from Urban Planning, we are running the seminar this term. So today and for the next 2 Fridays, we're going to have presentations related to student research that was presented at TRB in January in Washington, D.C. So every day we're going to have 2 student presenters for the today and 2 other Fridays. So and today we have 2 students from civil engineering, Gehrke and Alvaro Caviedes. So each one is going to have approximately 20 minutes, and after that there is going to be an opportunity to ask questions because the topics are somewhat related but not really related. So I think it's better to ask questions after each presentation. But, you know, for time management, we're just going to, cap the questions to, 5 to 10 minutes, yeah? And then if you cannot ask your question, write it up or use the email, yeah? So please, Steve.
Thank you, Miguel. I'm excited to be doing this Friday transportation seminar. I was speaking with Renata beforehand, and I think this is the 4th time I've done it as a student, and it's looking like it'll be the last time as a student, so that's exciting. All right, and so this research is part of my dissertation study, and so I'd like to acknowledge my co-author and my advisor, Dr. Kelly Clifton's contribution on this work, entitled A Pathway Linking Smart Growth Neighborhoods to Household-Level Pedestrian Travel. Okay, so I'm just going to give some brief sort of big picture context of this research. And so the better half of 3 decades of research has sort of looked at this idea of the transportation land use connection. And so as a planners, we're interested in this because we believe that we have the potential to moderate travel behaviors by making alterations to line development patterns in urban design. And one of the more sort of popular policies to come out of this belief are these ideas of smart growth neighborhoods or livable communities, walkable environments. And so these are environments that we hope create these activity-friendly, walkable communities. And so they're kind of 3 or so kind of heralded tenets of smart growth development. And so the first of which is this idea of compact development. And so you have these dense sort of developments with complex land use configurations. Then you have a high activity density, so these areas have a lot of nearby opportunities. So not just a lot of residences, but also a lot of out-of-home places that you can visit to conduct travel. And then finally, if it's going to be in a walkable environment, it needs to have some sort of pedestrian-oriented design. So looking at the specific infrastructure of the transportation system within these smart growth contexts. And so this past decade or so, there's been increased research and also policies that have come forth from this work. And so one of the bigger, partnerships was the 2009 Sustainable Communities Initiative. And so this is a partnership between the EPA, HUD, and USDOT to kind of look at visioning these smart growth neighborhoods into developing walkable communities. However, we're doing research, and there's always additional need for that. And so if we have this as a policy, and we're talking about sort of smart growth development, we need to have some sort of identified list of indicators that measure what the built environment really is aspiring to communicate, and then also setting a common set of standards to what a smart growth neighborhood entails. And so I just point out that past active travel studies, they're only been around for the past 10 years or so, looking into this phenomenon, and a lot of them have sort of adopted imperfect built environment measures, and this sort of was more the concentration of my first empirical study in my dissertation. I'm not going to talk much about that here. But then there's also this host of individual societal and contextual factors that we know also relate to travel behavior. So it's not just simply the built environment that matters. It's also these other things that matter, and it's important to account for them as well. So with that sort of big picture overview, I just go over a couple of study objectives I had. And so the first of which was to introduce a multidimensional construct of the built environment. And so this is a measure of the built environment that tries to get at those 3 different aspects I pointed out. So the pedestrian-oriented design, the activity, high activity concentration, and the land use mixing. And by doing so, I hope to offer insight into the measurement selection and then also the packaging of these different elements. So all these different aspects of the built environment work in different ways. And so understanding sort of how do these bundle together is important if we're going to identify a set of indicators. And then the second objective of the study was to then propose a framework in which I link this construct that kind of fell out from this first part and put it into a larger conceptual framework to understand pedestrian travel. And so there's a lot of different pathways and a lot of different factors that potentially confound the relationship of the built environment with walking. And so it's important to simultaneously account for those different pathways. And doing so will extend our understanding of the link between walkable communities and walking behaviors. And so when I start saying terms like simultaneously accounting for things and latent constructs, it sort of leads you down a methodological rabbit hole that is structural equation modeling. And so that was the application within this work. And so the sort of past studies within the transportation land use field, there's only been a few that have looked at using structural equation modeling to understand these relationships. And the earliest studies kind of looked at individual perceptions, and so how do we view the built environment? And so these explored themes of neighborhood accessibility, sort of the arrangement, the aesthetic of the environment, and then also just what's the sense of place that people get from an area, and then relating these two. Mostly it was looking at auto ownership and vehicle mode choice, so not really looking at active travel behaviors. And so perceptive measures offer a lot of valuable insight, but they have a couple shortcomings in that there's potential reporting biases that occur. These are people's perceptions and subjective measures. So they may potentially inflate this connection that we're seeing. And then secondly, with perceptive measures, it's tough to kind of translate it over to objective measures that we can kind of have guide our policies of smart growth development. And so that was sort of the first body of literature looking at this SEM application in transportation land use. There have been a few studies that have looked at objective measures of the built environment. And so early studies by Veronique van Acker and colleagues over in Europe offered some insight into this, but only looked at a limited number of built environment indicators. And again, we're looking sort of at auto-related outcomes of ownership, and et cetera. And then there have been a handful of more recent studies, but only a few that test more built environment indicators. So as we have more disaggregate data available to us, we can kind of add complexity to the measures we're looking at. But these studies have typically looked at short and long-term decisions of automobile, so ownership, auto travel. Again, not really getting at walkability and walking behaviors. And so going through this short research, I identified a couple of gaps that informed this study. And so the first of which is that, as I mentioned, few studies have exclusively measured the built environment with objective measures, and we sort of need this if we're going to set policies that have some sort of objective of like how much density there should be, how much mix there should be in area, et cetera. And then also these studies largely look at auto-related outcomes, and so the contribution to this study then is looking at the active travel outcomes. Okay, and so with that sort of background in the literature, I put forth this conceptual framework as to how we're going to look at all these different elements and how they interact. And so thinking of the built environment, it can be categorized into three different aspects. And so you have land development patterns. So what's the mix of an area of different land uses? What's the density within this area? Then you have the urban design. So that's getting at sort of a more micro-scale vision of the built environment, and that's the arrangement and aesthetic of the environment. And then finally, it's important to also consider the transportation system. So what's the infrastructure that's available to the traveler, and then what's the performance of that infrastructure? So using that as sort of how we think about the built environment, there's been an established connection that this is linked to travel behaviors and patterns. And so, a common way to kind of look at this in modeling is trip distance informing our mode choice. And so that's what we're looking for here. However, this connection isn't sort of enough because we know there's these other factors that are in play. These are socioeconomic characteristics and also psychosocial measurements, so attitudes and beliefs and stuff. And this can be measured at the individual level, the household level, or the neighborhood level. And so it becomes getting pretty complex when we start thinking about these things because these have directions that go into these different aspects as well. And there's also a handful of other contextual factors that I'm not going to get into at this point. But so that's sort of the framework that I proposed within this study, or proposed to kind of go forward with this study. And so the region that I looked at was here in Portland, and so I looked at the 3 counties, not just the Portland metro region, but the 3 counties surrounding, so I got to capture the rural areas as well, and looking at land development patterns. And then on the transportation information, I used 2011 Oregon Household Activity and Travel Survey, and so I think some of us are familiar with this research, but this is a one-day travel diary that was captured for the entire state, recording individuals' travel patterns and their sociodemographic and economic attributes for the subsample that I looked at within this region, it was just 4,400 households. Okay, and so that's sort of the travel data. And then the built environment, I looked at a set of 62 indicators. So this got a little carried away, but this far exceeds kind of how other people have looked at measuring the built environment within an SEM framework, and a lot of studies haven't really considered this many built environment measures. So they covered those 3 different aspects, and I'll go into them in the coming slides. And information for these were provided by a lot of secondary sources, including ARLIS here at Portland Metro, and then sort of more publicly available resources from the census and longitudinal employer household dynamic data sets. Okay, so then kind of circling back then to how we measured the built environment, so these 62 different indicators. And admittedly, a lot of it was focused on land use mixing. So the sort of impetus or the first works within my dissertation looked at this concept. And so it can be either the composition, so what are the types of land uses within an area, and what's their areal apportionment. So you have half the neighborhood is residence, half the neighborhood is commercial. But that doesn't really get at all of land use mixing. And so there's this additional component which was introduced in landscape ecology theory that sort of gets at this configuration. So how do we intersparse these different land uses within an area? And those together sort of capture what this phenomenon of land use mixing is. And so there's a number of measures. These ones down here haven't really been introduced in previous studies. Then on the density side, a lot of measures and ones that we're pretty familiar with, so like population density, housing density, employment density, and the different subsectors. And then looking at the sort of joint total activity, so the population and employment density within a neighborhood. And then I didn't have information on aesthetic and performance for this study. However, I did look at the arrangement and infrastructure, so to capture those other elements. And so there's a list of measures there that I looked at. These ones sort of in the center, these are connectivity indices that were reintroduced by Jennifer Dill in a study about a decade ago, and then also more prominence in work by David Levinson. And so those also look at sort of the grid of the network and get at sort of the pedestrian-oriented nature, as does these transportation-related measures that I incorporated. So a lot of built environment measures there, and so obviously there's going to be some redundancy, maybe whether it's in how the correlations amongst them, or just that they kind of represent the same concept. And so a first step was to sort of just perform a simple correlation analyses to eliminate some of these, so to get something that's a little more digestible to look at. And so I eliminated some of these measures. And then I performed an exploratory factor analysis. So this is a data distillation process in which you try to see how different indicators sort of group together. And maybe they portray or underlie some other construct, some greater construct. And so that would give me sort of a theoretic understanding of how they bundled together these different attributes. And then that sort of informed the final piece, which was to put it in that larger conceptual framework. And so that's the structural equation modeling approach, where you have 2 aspects. You have this confirmatory factor analysis where you identify the latent constructs by using those different indicators. And then, so I want to get at, a smart growth neighborhood, looking at employment concentration and stuff like that. And then you want to simultaneously look at those within the path analysis that accounts for those different directions that we're accounting for. So attributes of the traveler, but also the built environment and how they play a role in each another. So we'll cut to the results of sort of the confirmatory factor analysis. So that first aspect where I'm trying to get at what are the latent constructs of the built environment. And the first one that sort of unfolded was this notion of land use mixing. And so this had 5 indicators, and the model performance was pretty well on it. And so you label these, and that's sort of the point of these latent constructs. And so, but these different indicators, I surmise, sort of represent this notion of land use mixing. And so just to call attention to maybe the first indicator and the last indicator, which represent composition and configuration, respectively. So activity-related complementarity is an extension on the entropy index, which assumes that an equal balance of all land uses in an area is this ideal level of mixing. But there's no real strong theory saying that an equal balance of residences, retail, and industry in an area is going to promote more walking. And so instead, I used weights that were based on the distribution of activities that people travel to within the OHAS data set to develop a way of allocating this space differently. And so we know that residential and retail is going to have a stronger connection for people's travel behaviors, but industry maybe not. Maybe occupationally you're going to do that, but you're not going to walk too often to a manufacturing plant, perhaps. So that was one contribution of this construct. The second one was the contagion index, and so this gets at sort of that explicit spatial representation, so this pixelated. notion of land use mixes, different land uses within an area. And so that together kind of represented this notion of land use mixing. A second construct that fell out was this idea of employment concentration. This one's a little more straightforward. It's essentially just an area with a lot of retail jobs, a lot of office jobs, and a high unequal balance of employment to population. And so this gives an area where individuals can walk to either for work or shopping activities, et cetera. And then the final or third construct that came out of this analysis was this idea of a pedestrian-oriented design. And this borrows from each of the three aspects. And so this is an area that has a lot of small retail within it, so places that we can walk to, sort of this idea of a traditional neighborhood. A connected node ratio that's pretty high, so a gridded street network, and then finally a high proportion of sidewalk coverage. So altogether, that sort of is a pedestrian-oriented neighborhood. And so that was promising. So we found these sort of three constructs to represent the built environment, and then we plugged it into that larger framework to understand the different relationships. And I hypothesized that maybe this relates to some second-order construct, and it's not alone, that these together tell us something else. And I did find that this had a second-order construct and with high loadings and sort of a strong model fit, and I'm terming this a smart growth neighborhood. So a smart growth neighborhood, again, is kind of related to these three different phenomena. And so those together sort of represent the smart growth neighborhood concept. And then I linked this to travel behaviors and patterns. And so again, looking at trip distance, but then knowing that trip distance has an impact on whether we walk for transportation modes or just walk for recreational purposes. And so modeled all those links as well, and then finally added in, and it may be tough to see in the back, but there's a number of different socio-demographic and economic characteristics that were provided by the OHAS data set that also incorporated, and these include the number of vehicles per licensed adult or the number of children in the household, et cetera. And so using SCM, I was able to model all these different relationships and kind of tease out really what is the importance of smart growth neighborhoods on walking behaviors. And so I'm just going to kind of quickly shoot to what the big outcomes of that link are, and not kind of go over the other stuff, but yeah, it did well. Okay, so the outcome that I studied here, and it's admittedly not an ideal operationalization of the idea of walking, but it's the household level decision to participate in one or more home-based walk trip, and this is for transportation purposes, so walking to go to work, walking to go to school, or walking to go to the store, et cetera. And so the outcomes of this, looking at the socio-demographic attributes, were pretty intuitive and straightforward. So the direct effect that it had on this outcome, magnitudes, this is going straight to the outcome, whereas the total effect accounts for the accumulation of all the different pathways and mediating effects. And I found, that having a higher number of children above the age of 6, so an age that child could walk, in your household is a strong positive influence on the decision to walk for transportation purposes, as is having a higher education or a negative impact of having more income or more vehicles within there, so you're going to drive more often than walking. But interestingly, when I looked at this second-order construct, I saw that the smart growth neighborhood had a larger magnitude, both for the direct effect and the total effect. So there's something to be said about looking at the cumulative impact of the built environment and not just looking at these individual indicators when we think about its influence on travel. And then the other outcome was looking at the same decision to participate in one home-based walk trip, but this is for discretionary purposes. So this is walking for recreation or walking to a friend's house and stuff like that. And so this, admittedly, is it's harder to explain the variation in this, right? We don't know why we walk for fun and stuff all the time. And so there's less significance in the attributes that are the predictors. However, they're still intuitive in their direction and relative magnitude with each other. And then we did see, though, it's lesser. Still, the cumulative impact on this outcome for the smart growth neighborhood was strong, both directly and then counting for the other pathways as well. So a promising finding. Kind of validated this research a little bit. I understand this research, is a little nuanced in that I'm using structural equation modeling, and that's sort of one of the contributions of it is its methodological approach. But there are some contributions to this study that have more policy or practical implications. And so the first big picture is that I looked at found this second order construct that describes what I say is a smart growth neighborhood, and this is entailing, again, the pedestrian-oriented design, employment concentration, and land use mixing. And so those are important facets if we're thinking about developing smart growth neighborhoods. And So once again, if we're thinking about the indicators, I would point out those different indicators representing those phenomena, and so that's something that we could use in planning documents or as measurements to represent these ideals. And then I think what was an interesting finding in there is that the density measure, both in the second order construct, had the lowest magnitude, so it had the least impact on the smart growth neighborhood, and population density wasn't within that construct. And so a lot of the times when we're trying to develop areas to promote more walking, the first thing that people will fight back at is this idea of increasing the density of an area. And so now we can say, well, it isn't necessarily just the density that matters, although it may matter on its own. Within this construct, things like land development pattern and urban design also have a big cumulative impact. And so I think those are a little more palatable for people if you bring those to the table. Secondly, I showed in those last slides the demonstrated link between the smart growth neighborhood. So linking walkable environments to walking. That sort of highlights this continued prospect of, okay, smart growth makes sense. Let's continue doing this work, especially if we're looking to increase physical activity, walking behaviors, and active travel. So it's an empirical study, and it has a number of sort of shortcomings or limitations and next steps, but I'll just point out a couple of them here. And so one is that I looked a lot at the impact of, I spent a lot of time measuring the built environment, looking at that impact on travel. I didn't give as much attention as maybe is necessary to the sociodemographic and economic attributes of the individual, or also their psychosocial beliefs, attitudes. And so that should be given a little more thought in the future, and that could also be developed as a latent construct that describes people's lifestyles, like something like that. A hierarchical framework is sort of just getting at that idea that when I looked at walking, I was looking at the household decision to make a walking trip, and that's not a perfect measure of walking. We know that that's an individual level decision that has household dynamics play a role, but it's ultimately an individual decision. And so if you hierarchical model, I could kind of capture those different levels of decision makers. That's a little out of my realm as far as methodological complexity. And then finally, further attention. So I looked at the 1 mile aerial buffer around a person's home location for this study. However, greater consideration can be given to the choice of scale. So is it a half mile? Is it a quarter mile where these matter at? Is it the destination and not the origin that matters more? And so I looked at this more in my third dissertation paper, and maybe next year I can come back and present the findings on that. But thank you. Hopefully some of that made sense, and I think I'll open up to any questions that folks have.
My name's Steve Young, and I'm not sure exactly how to ask this, but is there some way in your model that looked at people choosing to live in smart built environments because they wanted to be in a walkable environment?
Yeah, that's the big question, right, is this idea of self-selection, right? And so we move into areas because we want to have certain travel characteristics, right? I live in a neighborhood because I want to ride my bike and stuff like that. And so this is a cross-sectional data set that I used. And so a structural equation model allows you to forego some of the problems of that. However, it doesn't get around that idea of time precedence, right? And so I don't know where you lived before, how that translates to where you live now. And so I think that's a huge question in transportation land use research. And, it matters, but studies have shown that, even if you do account for residential self-selection in some way, there's still this strong connection between the built environment and travel. So, there's sort of this idea that you can maybe still get people who traditionally drive a lot to forego auto use for walking if the environment's right.
The segment where they're walking for transportation purposes, did that include origin and destination within the radius, or did that include as well walking to a public transit point for a longer journey?
Yeah, so to each of those, I guess the latter part is that I didn't look at walk trips to transit, and so that I just looked at walk trips, and I called those walk trips to transit, or non-walking trips. But the idea of that the environment matters along our route, right? And so that's like the work of Joe Broach and others here at PSU. And so look at how does the built environment along the path matter? If you're capturing sort of a walk shed of a 1 mile, you can surmise to some degree that people aren't going to walk much farther than that 1 mile, but still people do walk longer than 1 mile, and parts of that don't matter into where they walk, right? And so I think that you could tease out a lot of stronger relationships if you were able to have that, and that may come from GPS information or whatever it may be. Here I just had information on what the individuals reported as being where they're at, where they're going to, and what mode they took, so I can't really figure out what path they took, but yeah, that's a great point. Sure.
So you said density matters less. Is there a minimum density that you found that is kind of like the smart growth threshold?
Yeah, so I didn't take the next step. I know I kind of like aimed high at the beginning, and then I kind of fell short a little bit at the end there. But so with density, I was measuring it just as sort of a continuous measure, and so I didn't break it up into intervals where you can maybe get at like, under 2,000 persons per acre or something like that as the no-go area or something like that. But yeah, I think that's a point to look at. I think just saying, and I'm not saying that density doesn't matter, I'm just saying that density didn't play a role in this second level construct. And so if I was to individually take out population density and put into this model as sort of an exogenous indicator, it could have a significant effect, but I know that it doesn't, because I tested it, doesn't really have such a strong magnitude on it, but it does matter a little bit. It's just not, it's not unfolding within that greater 3 sort of tiered measure that I came up with. So,
A question is, you basically assume even for SEMs, only it adds a lot more complexity to capture the direct and indirect effects. But I believe you still assume those relationship is linear, correct? That the density that from the current very low density, that double the density, will have similar effects on where already a infill development where you already have pretty high density, and then we increase the density.
Yeah.
We assume those effects will be similar when we increase a similar percentage at different places. What's your thinking on that? And also, another aspect in thinking is there are those different density, diversity, and design. There may not be kind of working in a compensatory way. It means you can increase density that essentially compensate for diversity or design, but it may be that there are some interactions between those different aspects. It means you need to have a certain level of density and a certain diversity mix of land use, and also you need have some at least acceptable design. You need to get all 3 things correct instead of just have one very high but pretty bad only 2 others.
yeah, and so just to go back to the first question, so the linear effect, and so the link function in here isn't linear, but I understand what you're saying is that it's an incremental change, and so there was a recent sort of work in JAPA that came out by Mark Stevens, and that sort of reviewed, and he sort of forego looking at structural equation modeling because you can't really get at the elasticities, and so the unit changes just a little bit. And so I don't have that information to really look at, what is the incremental change of just bumping up the density a little bit or just changing the mix a little bit. And so, unfortunately, I think that's just sort of a shortcoming right now of the method. But I do agree that there's an assumption that's inherent within there that I'm saying that's a linear relationship. Then on the second part of your second question, which is looking at, okay, do these act in concert? So I do make an assumption that, if they're all within one construct, if you move one, you're moving the other ones as well. And yeah, I think that there could be interactions at play within there that would add further complexity to the model, but you can look at sort of some interaction effects, whether it's dividing the neighborhoods up to kind of pool them into separate bins. But yeah, I think that's important, that you can't you could possibly compromise the pedestrian-oriented nature of an area if you increase the density too high. And so within this measure, I'm hoping that the construct may begin to have a negative impact when you get up to a certain point, because I'm counting for them simultaneously. But yeah, I think it gets a little messy and tricky to figure out. Cool. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alvaro Caviedes. I'm a civil engineering and urban planning master's student. For the last year and a half, along with Dr. Figliozzi, Dr. Lee, Dr. Liu, and another student called Feng, we worked in a project about measuring stress levels for cyclists. We started with a pilot study, which we presented in TRB 2016, and then we developed a more robust methodology, and that project we presented it at TRB 2017. I was not able to go to that TRB, so I'm very happy to present you the results in this session. So the title of the presentation is Measuring Stress Levels for Real-World On-Road Cyclists. Do bicycle facilities, intersections, and traffic level affect cyclist stress? So it's not a mystery for you that bicycle transportation is a very good option for urban dense and congested areas. It's like a very cheap, and cities are trying to promote this. But there is a problem with that, is that there are not too many resources, and there is not too much space available to build bike lanes. So another problem with that is people are not people that don't ride the bicycle, they don't feel very confident about riding the bicycle as a commuting option. So researchers have been trying to solve these questions, trying to figure out what can we do, what can the city do in order to increase the ridership, the bicycle ridership. So in order to do this, researchers are trying to understand bicyclist perception on urban facilities. And in order to answer this, there are three main components that you have to take into account. One is safety. How safe is the infrastructure? Stress, which is how stressed feel people biking in a bike lane or next to the traffic. And finally, comfort. How easy is to ride on those facilities? So there are two main approaches, two main methodologies, experimental designs, to try to find out the answers for these questions, for understand bicyclist perception, naturalistic and non-naturalistic studies. On non-naturalistic studies are studies where the researcher has a total control of the environment. So one easy example is a researcher asking you what kind of infrastructure you prefer to bike, a bike lane or a roadway. And on the other hand, we have naturalistic, where it's the experimental design where the researcher doesn't have control of the environment. So one example is just setting a camera and recording an intersection and seeing what is the trajectory of the cyclist, of the pedestrian, gender, age group, etc. But the problem with this is that it's very time-consuming, and at the end of the day, you cannot tell what is the perception of the cyclist. The researcher is assuming what is the perception based on the video. So what we focus on this study was measuring stress level. Currently, there is this index called bicycle level of stress and bicycle level of service, which tells you that, like, based on different characteristics of the road and, like, on the condition of the traffic, for example, volume, they can tell you, like, how stressed people are going to be. But this is, like, a very aggregated approach, and it doesn't, like, give you, like, a very detailed information about the subject. So in terms of stress, stress is something that you can measure, that is a response to an event that you can measure psychological or physiologically. Most of the studies in this area have been done in the health field. So, for example, there are methodologies where, like, people can tell you based on, like, health pressure, based on, like, blood pressure, heart pressure, how stressed you feel, if you feel angry or sad or happy. But not too many of these studies have been done in the transportation field. So that's the focus of our study, try to measure bicycle trip stress levels using physiological data, specifically galvanic skin response, which I'm going to talk about later. So we're trying to answer 3 research questions. The first one is, does peak traffic impact stress levels? So this is a surrogate for traffic volumes. So higher volumes cause more stress levels than lower volumes. The second question is, do intersections impact stress level? So if the cyclist is, like, going along an intersection, it causes more stress than going, like, in just a segment of the road. Or if the cyclist is waiting, like, for the green light to cross the road, does it cause stress to him or to her? And the third question is, does facility type or proximity to motorized traffic impact the stress levels? In other words, like, bike lanes cause stress or not, or, like, a segregated facility causes stress or not. So to answer this question, we went for, like, the physiological measure approach, trying to, like, measure, like, the stress levels, measuring, like, things in your body. So there is this concept called galvanic skin response, skin conductance. So when you feel stress, your nervous systems respond to that event, and that causes that your sweat glands increases their size. And when that happens, you start to sweat more. You are secreting more sweat. And this can be measured because when you sweat more, if you basically send a current in your skin, because you have more sweat, you will see that the currency level is going to be higher. But if you are not stressed, this current level is going to be very low. So this is what this sensor can measure. And it can measure, like, the emotional arousal to any event. And this concept, maybe you know, it has been used in other, like, fields. For example, the lie detectors. So people were online, they feel more stress, and they start to secrete more sweat. And it's not, like, very obvious. It's not that you are sweating a lot, but this minimal increase in sweat, that it can be measured by these detectors. So in the transportation field, there have been like two studies that have explored, like, stress levels using GSR data. One of the two of them are, like, in trying to measure driver stress level. So this is a study, this is a figure from Gehrke, where, like, the y-axis is stress level and the x-axis is time. So he started, like, to drive, and this is one of the trips he took. And as you can see, as he was driving, like, the stress levels were increasing until, like, in one part of the trip he crashed to another car, and that was, like, the highest stress levels for that trip. And he also compared that to other events, for example, like going to a class or things like that, to just trying to have a baseline, and also to other, like, more extreme events, like this high peak that represents an event where, like, the researcher jumped from a plane. So for the methodology, we started, like, with a pilot study, as I told you, which is just one subject biked along this route, and we collected the data. And this pilot study was held to see the feasibility of GSR in, like, trying to measure stress levels. Then when we found out that it was working, we decided to, like, take the research to another level, like using more subjects. We used 6 subjects with different characteristics, so different age, different experience biking. We had, like, people that, like, hasn't touched a bike, like, in 5 years, or people that are more experienced with the bike, that like bike 5 days a week for commuting. We collected data for peak and off-peak hour, and the length of the trip was about like 3 miles, and it took 30 minutes to bike. So the trip started in the engineering building, and it went like through 2 different facilities. So bike lanes, the waterfront with like it's a separated infrastructure. It also shared the space with cars, and there were like 2 kinds of bike lanes here, like with like a vehicle buffer and not vehicle buffer, just like a painted lane. And for the people like who like are not very familiar with this infrastructure of this road, it looked like this. So totally separated from traffic, with the traffic, the buffer, vehicle buffer bike lane, and the painted bike lane. For the equipment, so because when you are biking, it's obvious that you are going to start to sweat. So we try to control for those situations to just see which were the events where you really felt the stress and not it was just like a response for the exercise. So we got this device called power meter, which measures the power and the torque you put into the bicycle, which is a surrogate of how much effort are you putting on the exercise. This is the shimmer sensor, which is the device that measures the stress levels. We also developed an Android app that collected the GPS data of the trip, and of course the bicycle. So this was like it looked like, and the cyclists also had to like wear a vest during the trip. We also worked along the computer science department, and they developed this software and this helmet. This helmet was used to basically record the videos and all 4 different videos for all the different angles, and they were synchronized by time. And they also developed this software to make easier the post-processing phase, so we could see where the bike was biking, like the stress levels, signals, all the signals, and also the different videos. So for the results, we first studied like all the results together. We put all the results together, and we found like very interesting things. We went like event by event for every subject, and we found that, for example, in this intersection, this is like Nate and Morrison, people felt very stressed because trying to cross that is very hard. You have to like be aware of like at least 4 vehicle movements in order to go to the other side of the road. Or there were other cases like, so when we aggregated the data, we didn't see this effect, but for people that were starting to ride the bicycle, when they were riding like along a bike lane like this, a painted bike lane, they felt more stressed than just biking in this kind of infrastructure where it's totally separated by the parked vehicles. So now, like based on that, now we continue to answer the research questions we had. The first one was, does peak traffic impact stress levels? And we found evidence for this. At peak hour, people were like, the stress level were greater than at off-peak hour. Then do intersection impact stress levels? So the answer again is yes. We found evidence for this. So at intersections, we found that people felt stressed because the process of like stopping and just waiting for the green light, and even if there was no traffic for them, if there was no traffic on the road, they could cross, but because as a part of the protocol of this research was just complying with the law, they felt a stress of like just waiting even if they could like cross. Or sometimes, like in this intersection where there was no traffic control, it was like very stressful moments for them. And the third question was like, does facility type or proximity to motorized traffic impact stress levels? And we found evidence for this. So on a street response, so for example, shared roadway with vehicles or like painted bike lanes were like more stressful than off-street facilities, like biking along the waterfront. Then we developed a more like detailed model because we have 6 subjects. They had different characteristics that we couldn't see. So we measure a multi-level regression model where we could compare results between subjects and within subjects, and we found similar results. So we developed 4 models, and for the 4 models, we found that peak hour was like a main thing. Like it was like a very good explanatory variable for stress level. The same for signalized intersections. We found that bike lane, like painted bike lane, like biking along a bike lane was like stressful too. We found that biking along a multi-use path, so the separated facility wasn't stressful, it was the less stressful facility. But we didn't find any evidence for shared roadway. And this was mainly because like around half of the subjects were like very confident about biking. So this kind of like affected the data. And also within our route, not too many segments were shared roadway. So we couldn't see this effect with more detail. Although like analyzing like for the pilot study or for like some subjects, we found this difference. So for conclusions, so the main findings is like it's feasible to measure stress levels for cyclists using GSR. It's something that like people can explore. There was evidence that says that a time of the day, like peak hour, a traffic facility, a bike facility, or if it's an intersectional segment, have an impact on stress levels. And these have implications in bike design for like for like policies, urban policies. So one is that there has to be cyclist priority at busy intersections. Second one is like the best bike facility like a city can provide to encourage more bicycle trips is a separated facility. And finally, to encourage like new trips for people that are not very like good at biking or are afraid of biking, like considering the difference between a painted bike lane or a separated bike lane is very important because that's the way you can like encourage them to do it. And with that, I would like to finish the presentation, and thanks NITSI for supporting this project along with the computer science department and the civil engineering department.
Richard Henry. I was wondering if you noticed any stress level differences between like experienced bicyclists and new bicyclists.
Yeah, so we had 2 unexperienced bicyclists, and we found like the main spots where they felt stressed were like at shared roadways, and like as I showed you in the map, in where they were like in the bike lane, with any separation to the traffic, they felt like very stressed, like they had this greater stress levels than experienced bicyclists. But in the rest of the road, it was like almost the same. We also found that for experienced bicyclists, they felt very stressed at separated infrastructure when the pedestrian volume was very high, because they had to be very aware of like all pedestrians, trying to avoid them and keeping the speed they were like having. So those kind of events cause more stress for experienced bicyclists.
My name is Dominic. I was wondering, because you first tried the experiment and then you realized that it worked, right? Mm-hmm. I was wondering, what were the indicators that it worked? Was it because the equipment was working properly, or was it some kind of readings that indicated?
That's a good question. So for the pilot study, it was one research, so we couldn't like make like very broad like conclusions, but we found that like looking to the video like event by event, we could see that in a stressful event, for example, when like a car was turning left or right, or like when like a pedestrian just jumped into the tree of the trajectory of the cyclist, the stress levels were like getting high. So it was good for us to see these events because no other studies have explored this, so it was kind of new. Also, we had like we kind of have like a question about the feasibility of this sensor, because the sensor was like it contained 2 electrodes that you put in your fingers. So when you were biking, that was kind of affecting that, because for example, you can like move your hands and that can affect the measurement. But we didn't see that, and we also kind of see that putting the electrodes in other part of the hand it worked. So that's how we like measure that feasibility.
Do you know if the study is going to be repeated with a larger sample
So not by now, but that was one of like the biggest limitations we had to try to like take these conclusions to the population level. So, but by now we don't have like plans to like get more subjects on this project.
Matt Bauer. I just have a question, like on the equipment. Do you think, because you had the helmet with the cameras and the hand sensor, do you think that might have affected some of the data, especially on the less experienced biking around with and having kind of in their mind all these sensors on them?
Yeah, that's another good question, and that was another limitation we had, because we were trying to like measure stress levels and like bicycle perception, but because cyclists knew that they were being observed, that could affect the data. But in some cases, not in all of them, we kind of see that at the beginning of the trip, like the measurements were very irregular, but then like when like the cyclists, this is my like intuition, when the cyclists started to feel more comfortable about like the trip and like kind of like forgave all the things he was just like wearing, and also the cyclist had to be aware of the trip. So for example, if he or she had to take left or turn or take this route, so that kind of like took away the cyclist from that thought of like having everything on him, on her.
Did you think at all about distinguishing stress level versus effort? Because certain situations like intersections where you have to accelerate very quickly, you're going to have naturally a sweat response to that. So that's whether you're actually stressed or not. Yeah. Is there a way that you can tell the difference between places where cyclists might just be exerting more effort and sweating?
So this device, the power meter, like it's just, you put it like here, right? So when you're like in the intersection and you put more effort, that that sensor collects that data. So with that data, we could control for those situations where, like, of course, sweat levels were going to be high.
Whether the bicyclists were also car owners or drivers as well?
Yes, and so the unexperienced riders were the ones who were drivers. But so we didn't like see any, we didn't have like too many subjects with those characteristics to make any conclusions about that or to find any evidence. And also, like based on the experience of riding a bicycle, we use that as a surrogate for like people that can shift from cars to bicycles.
Were there any conversations about the impact of the presence of law enforcement on how comfortable people were on the roads and maybe their ability, cycling and their knowledge of vehicle codes and rules of the road for cycling?
Yeah. So when we started each trip for each subject, we had like a protocol where we told them that they had to comply the law when they were like doing the trip. And we did this because in order to do this research, we had to be very careful with the trip because something can happen and we were going to be responsible for those things. So we like make explicit that subjects have to comply with the law. And that was like the extent of that. But we also like, because of that, we saw those differences in like expert cyclists on intersections where they wanted to cross the intersection, but they couldn't because they had to wait for the green light.
Could you go back to the redoes?
This one?
Yeah, yes. Explain a bit what the difference between, you mentioned clearly, those are different control for different factors. Can you explain a bit what are the difference between those four models? Yeah. And then how do you categorize the importance for different variables?
So what we did with these models was trying to evaluate what we found in the t-test we did to answer the research questions. So basically, the first model, so the difference in these three models is that we were evaluating different bicycle facilities. So we started with bike lane, then shared roadway, and then multi-use path. And we found that from these three, the best one to predict stress level was bike lane. And then, but we also found significance in this one. So in model 4, we decided to take these two variables to make a model that take into account these two facilities to explain the stress level. But this model, the power of this model was lower than the first model.
Those signs just indicate the level as significant.
Exactly.
Not comparing.
No, not comparing the values, yeah.
Yeah, but also I think the positive in the multipath, it has a negative impact. So maybe someone looking at this and see plus, plus, plus would think that, multi-use path will increase the stress, but it's the other way around. It's significant, very significant, it reduces the stress.
Yeah.
So when you look at those plus, 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 don't think that it's necessarily more.
Yeah, that's like significance level.
I thought, I didn't pay attention on that. Yeah, so that's something you probably want to see whether you can use a different way to represent those information. Right. Other questions from?
That's perfect because we're